Hi everyone, this is Deborah. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing some more on my Dream Tiles journal. So this is it here, and I have to do this as a voiceover because I filmed it, and after I finished recording I didn't have any sound and I'm not sure what went wrong. So I'm just going to have to voice over it for you. Now there's a lot of work in this particular journal. It's taken me a long time. There's lots of laces and layering and fabrics and lots of detail. So I think I'm going to keep this journal for myself. I also really like that it's got some Spanish words on it, and I think I'm going to use it now as a journal to record the story of my grandfather and his family. So my grandfather was born in Argentina, and his parents were Welsh, so we are what is known as Welsh Patagonians. The Welsh left Wales and went to various places around the world, including Argentina, and the point of it was to get away from the persecution of the English. The English didn't want the Welsh to have their own language, their own religion, their own schools. So they left and went to Argentina, and my family were part of that. My great-great-grandfather Henry left Wales and took his wife and his children across to Argentina. My great-grandmother Ellen Jane was also born in Wales, and her parents also left Wales and went to Argentina. She was 2 when they went to Argentina, and I think my great-grandfather was about 9. So my great-grandparents were neighbours in Argentina, and that's how they met and married. At some point, Henry decided that he would go to the Welsh settlement that was being established in Chile, in a place called Nueva Imperial. And he took all of the family, including his son John, who was married by this stage, to Chile. Now John and Ellen had a couple of kids in Argentina, and when they got to Chile they had several more, but only one of those children actually survived. Then my great-great-grandfather's wife died in Chile, and so he packed up and he went back to Wales to be with his brother who lived in Wales, and the rest of his family who still lived in Wales. And they live in a little town which is around in South Wales, in what's known as the Valleys, and not far from a town called Pontypridd. And it's only a tiny town, and I've been there and I've visited the grave of my great-great-grandfather and various other relatives who are buried in the Welsh Tabernacle in this little town. So my great-grandfather John and his wife decided that they would go back to Argentina because they'd lost a number of children, and plus the land that the Chilean government had given them wasn't very good for growing anything. So they packed up and they went back to Argentina. They had another child there, or actually another couple of children, one of them being my grandfather, who was born in Argentina. Now the area of Patagonia is part of Argentina and Chile, and it's actually, from an Argentinian side, it's below the Pampas. So the towns that they went to, they lived in a little town called Delarven. There are also Welsh in Gaiman and Trelew, which is not far from each other. They're only little towns that are inland, and I visited them all when I took my parents back there in 1999. There's also a town on the coast called Portamadryn, and the Welsh are celebrated there. If you ever go there, you'll see that there are statues showing the Welsh landing in Argentina all those years ago, and there's museums and things. There's also a very strong Welsh presence still. We went to a number of Welsh high teas when we were in Argentina. There's also a Welsh church, and the children still learn to speak Welsh at home. They speak Spanish at school and Welsh at home, and they are the languages that my grandfather learnt. So he couldn't speak English when he came to Australia, and none of the family, I'm assuming that my great-grandfather could speak English, because he also spent a couple of years in South Africa. He used to drive trains there, and I'm not sure what the reasoning was behind him going to South Africa. Maybe he was just trying out another location for the family to live. So for a man born in those times, he was extremely well travelled. Then he returned to Argentina, and at some point he decided to bring the family to Australia. So he sold the family farm to make enough money for the 25 people to board the boat to come to Australia. The trip was delayed somewhat because the First World War had started, but they actually came to Australia in 1915. So they caught a boat from Portamadryn, and they had to catch the train to Portamadryn so they could leave. And it was actually my great-grandmother's brother, William, who drove the train that took all the family across to Portamadryn. Now, my great-grandmother's other brother, David, and his family, as well as her mother, also came to Australia. And they stopped and changed boats at Tenerife in the Canary Islands, and then came to Australia from there. And the story is that my grandfather was almost washed overboard going around the Cape of Good Hope, but he was saved by sailors. So luckily for me, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So my grandfather was about 9 when he arrived in Australia, not being able to speak English. He could speak Spanish and Welsh, but their family didn't keep the language up. Most of them married Australian or English descendant, people who'd come from England and therefore had lived in Australia and spoke English. So the language kind of went from the family. Although I do have a recording of my grandfather's sister, Annie, talking and telling about the family and the stories of living in Argentina and Chile. And she has a very Welsh lyrical voice when she spoke. She's since passed away. Unfortunately, my grandfather only lived till he was 60 and I was 10 at the time, so I really didn't get to know him and ask him all those stories that I would have liked to ask him. I began tracing my family tree when I was 16, and then I really got stuck into it when I was in my very early 20s and pregnant with my first child. And since then I've spent 40 odd years tracing my tree, and I know a lot of information. I've travelled the world doing it, and I'm particularly interested in the background stories of the family. So my father would tell me he couldn't really read very well because he only went to school for 4 years once he got to Australia, and with English not being his native language, I'm sure it was very hard for him. And Dad would say that when he read the local paper, it would take him all day just to read it, and it was a very small paper because they lived in a very small town. So he wasn't very good in terms of that, but he was a very smart man, like a lot of Welsh people. He was a very good farmer, and the Australian government actually enticed the Welsh to come to Australia to set up the irrigation channels around the Riverina, around Leeton and places like that. There are irrigation channels in South America as well that we saw when we went to visit, that the Welsh had actually built to grow crops. My great-grandfather chose Australia because he wanted to live under a British flag in an English-speaking country. And he also decided, once he got to Australia and he'd been here a while, that he wanted to move on and go to Canada. But by that time, I guess his wife was a bit sick of him dragging her around, and also a number of the children had already met and were either engaged or married to Australian partners, and so they decided that they weren't going to go with him, so he had to stop here in Australia. We also have many relatives back in Argentina and in Chile, many of whom I've met, and also cousins and things in Canada, because that was another big place where people moved from Argentina or Chile. and they left there and went to Canada. Now I'll just tell you a bit about what's happening on screen. I've decided that I wanted to bind this, and I didn't want to use my standard binding method, and I was going to do a tab binding, but then I decided that I didn't want to do that either, because I've got a lot of lace and things on the edges of the pages, and I didn't want the fabric to actually have to be covered over the top of that. So I cut some strips, and this is some French linen that I own, and I just own some offcuts of that, and it's really beautiful fabric. And I'm just sort of eyeballing a piece of that now to see where it might go. So I've taken a couple of the pages, and I've sewn some fabric onto the edge of them, just down the spine. So you can see this one here, and then the other one that I did before. And the plan is now to put them together and sew those pieces of fabric together, and you can see the results of it here, that I've got those pieces now, and 2 pieces of the fabric are on the actual spine. So far it's looking quite good, and I'm just checking that I can turn all the pages still, because this book has quite a few flip outs and things like that, so that I can get them and still make sure that I can flip the journal around, and that what I'm doing isn't going to interfere with actually using this particular journal. So I've got another piece here, and I'm just chopping that bit up into a similar size strip, and then I will sew it onto some more of the pages. So I'm just checking where to sew it. I don't want to sew it where it's really busy and I've got lots of embellishment. I'm trying to put it on to the piece of journal that doesn't have as much embellishment. So I think I ended up with quite a few pages in this journal, and it still actually turns quite well. You'll see that as I build up the pages, that the actual spine is keeping all the pages together but still allowing it to move quite well. So you can see that I've put a couple more pieces on, including that piece of fabric that was loose. So I'm just trimming it off, and now I think I'll trim it down some more, because I'm starting to get some unevenness on the edge of the journal. I'm just freehand trimming this. It's a junk journal. I quite like the look that I'm getting with all of the fabric there, and I'm still able to open up the pages so that I'll be able to use the journal. And here I'm showing how the spine is coming together. It's quite nice actually. I quite like the look of what it's doing there. Now these 2 pieces are shorter than the actual book, so I'm working out what I'm going to do with them, and you'll see in a moment that I end up putting a piece on them and sewing them down together. And here I've got a little piece of fabric on this lot now, and I'm just going to sew those together as well. I'm testing that I can still open it up, which I can. The next thing I needed to do was to put some sort of closure on it, and so I've actually chosen some sari silk that I own, and I'm just working out the size of it, and now I sewed it on just on the spine area so that you can have it tied up, but also it won't go anywhere once you actually start to use the journal. It will stay on the journal itself. See the spine, and it's quite fluffy. I quite like that. And just flipping through now, I have to put everything back into the journal because I haven't actually done that yet, and I've forgotten what goes where, so I'm just trying to work out what can go where. I'll have to go back and look at the previous video because I quite liked where they were at that time. I'm adding in some of the envelopes that I've made. I made quite a few of those little envelopes. I haven't glued them down. I may glue them later, but they're actually good. You can open them up and put things inside, or you can journal directly on the actual envelope itself. and there's lots of pockets and things in this one. I hope you enjoyed that, hearing a bit about my family history while watching me craft, and I apologise that I had to do the voiceover, but I'm really happy with the final journal. I think that it looks great, and I like the different binding method that I've used, and I think I may try that again on another day. But for now, this is Deborah. Thanks for watching. Cheers.